Hey nerds, so gonna comment again on Alex O'Connor, British YouTube philosopher, who's all nice and mustachy in this video, this glorious mustache, and he's making a clearly sophistic, yes, I looked up that word and it's a real word, sophistic argument for Richard Dawkins, famous militant atheist and evolutionary biologist, who of course wrote The Selfish Gene, and he has been a crusader against religion, along with the so-called four horsemen like Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett, like fucking decades ago. But anyway, he's making this clearly sophistic argument that Richard Dawkins, like obvious militant atheist, is actually a Christian because he's talked about this happened like probably a few years ago now. He talked about being a cultural Christian and living based on Christian customs and traditions in some sense. So we'll go into this clip and you can see how it's like clearly a sarcastic argument. Like he doesn't actually believe it, but this is the argument. He's basically presenting the argument that you can make for this.
Richard Dawkins is now being criticized for his supposition that he is and has all along been a cultural Christian. This has surprised many, but it should surprise none. As my friend John Nelson has liked to point out to me, Richard Dawkins does have all the makings of a perfectly good Anglican. He adores the prose of the King James Bible. He has an affinity for evensong. He loves the sound of church bells. And of course, he doesn't believe in God. Yes, Richard Dawkins is really here to remind us that by being a cultural Christian, all silver linings have a reductionistic material scientific explanation. Richard Dawkins.
Yeah, that's interesting. You can look at this from a few different ways, I think, and it's interesting because, okay, so for example, he's clearly poking the logical holes in the argument that Richard Dawkins is actually a Christian, like saying that by saying that he's practicing all of these Christian customs and traditions, he's going to church, he likes hearing church bells, he likes beautiful churches, that sort of thing. And he also doesn't believe in God, like a lot of Anglicans, because, you know, obviously a lot of religious people, probably the vast majority of religious people, don't actually read the Bible. They just go to church sometimes and they're like lapsed Christians in some sense, and they don't even necessarily actually believe in God. They just go to church and behave like a Christian because they think that's the good and right thing to do. That probably describes the majority of even religious people, or at least Christians in our postmodern culture in the West. So anyway, though, the other way that you can look at this is that it actually shows that Richard Dawkins and militant atheists like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris actually act like Christians because they have faith in materialistic, reductionist, scientific arguments for everything, which is what Alex points out there at the end. So he thinks that there's a materialist, reductionist, scientific argument for everything, which is fucking unbelievably stupid, really. Science, rationalism, and materialism are very important, and we should always pay attention to them, but they're far from the only aspect of reality that is important. There are many other things, like emotions and intuitions are actually sometimes more important than rational thinking, and we don't actually behave rationally, so we can attempt to practice more critical thinking and act more rationally, but we're not actually inherently doing that. We're naturally irrational beings. So anyway, Richard Dawkins, from a certain perspective, is a Christian, but not really. But you could say you could even say he's a Christian in two different ways, because you could say that he acts and behaves like a Christian, but doesn't believe in God, just like a lot of other British Anglicans. But he also worships scientific, reductionistic, materialistic arguments just as much as some religious people worship God. So he believes in and worships science just as much as some people worship as God. And, you know, it's fine to be religious. There's nothing wrong with science, of course. Science is a very good thing for the most part. And religion can be good or bad depending on who is using it. So you can say, obviously, in two different ways, militant atheist Richard Dawkins is a Christian because he behaves like a Christian and he worships science. So yes, militant atheist Richard Dawkins is a Christian.